We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 73a. On the previous summer, there was a machlokas Abaye and Rava when it comes to Eid Zomim. Abaye says L'mafreya hu nifsal, he is considered disqualified retroactively, meaning all testimony from after the point in time when he testified falsely is considered to be disqualified testimony. And Rava says Mikanu lahabahu nifsal, that he's only possible, he's only disqualified from this point in time when he was falsified and forward. But the previous testimony, even though it was after the time that he testified falsely, that previous testimony to when he actually was falsified by this other set of witnesses is still going to be kosher. And the Gemara is in the middle of giving two explanations behind Rava. The first explanation is that the entire concept of Edom Zomim is a chiddush, because who says we should believe the second witnesses that come in and falsify the first witnesses? Maybe we should believe the first witnesses, and therefore, since it's a chiddush, we only disqualify from the point in time that they're falsified and onward. We don't go back retroactively. And now the Gemara is giving the second explanation of Rava, that it's mishum pseida de lekuchos, that really it should have been lamafreya, it should have been retroactively, but it's not retroactively because we don't want the lekuchos, the purchasers who relied on these witnesses to buy things, we don't want them to lose out. As Rashi explains, pseida de lekuchos shechasmu al shtar mechir bein saim. Let's say these witnesses, they signed some kind of document of sale in the interim, so now we're going to disqualify all of those documents of sale. That's going to be a big loss to the lekuchos. And the Gemara says, "My beinayu," what's the difference between the two versions of Rava? And the Gemara says, "Dasidu be trei l'chad u'trei l'chad." Let's say you have a situation where two people testify about one of the witnesses, and they say imanu hayisam. They say about Ruvain, let's say that you were with us, your testimony is false. And then another two witnesses testify about the other witness that he was falsified. So in that situation, it's not a chiddush. When you have two against two, so then you have a chiddush. In that case, the idea that we believe the second set over the first set is a chiddush, and therefore, according to that explanation, again, in a situation of chiddush only, we say mikanu lahabo according to Rava. But if you have two witnesses falsifying one witness and two witnesses falsifying another witness, then it would not be a chiddush and it would be retroactive. Inami, or you can say another nafkamina between the two opinions within Rava, the paslinhu begaz lanusa. Let's say they falsified him, and in terms of saying that the individual was a thief, as Rashi says, begaz lanusa shelo hezimuhu elahi idu shnayim al elu shein gazlonim. They don't actually falsify him; they just testify about these witnesses that they are gazlonim, that they're thieves. Here you can't say, don't rely on these ones, why are you relying on these ones over these ones? It's a totally different testimony. They're saying these witnesses are not reliable because they're thieves, so in such a situation, it is not a chiddush in that case. So again, if it's not a chiddush, you could say they're puzzle retroactively, but there would be a concern of pseida de lekuchos. If the concern is the loss of the lekuchos, so then we would not say that they're disqualified retroactively, as the Gemara now explains, lishna, the amrit mishum chiddush, according to the one who says that the reason why it's not retroactive is because the whole concept is a chiddush. Lekas over here, it's not a chiddush, so it could be retroactive. But lahach lishna da'amrim mishum pseida lekuchos. But according to the version within Rava, that the reason is the loss of the lekuchos, so ika there is that concern, and it would not be retroactive. And the Gemara continues. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti. Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti said, "Avad Rav Papa uvdo kavase de Rava." That Rav Papa followed the opinion of Rava that mikanu lahaba, that it's only from this point in time forward that they are disqualified. Rav Ashi Amar hilchasa kavase de Abaya, but Rav Ashi says the halacha is like Abaya. And the halacha is like Abaya by Yal Kagam. That's an acronym for 6 cases where the halacha is like Abaya, and the ayin stands for Eid Zomim. The halacha is like Abaya in this case. Rashi says Yal Kagam Simone Shmuo, saying again, this is a mnemonic for various halachas. V'zu echad mehen Eid Zomim, and one of them is the ayin is Eid Zomim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Gonav al pishnayim, if the person steals and there are two witnesses that say that he stole, v'tavach u'machar al piyam, and then on those same two witnesses, by the mouths of those same two witnesses, he slaughtered or he sold the animal, v'nimtzu zomim, and it turns out that the edim are false, mishalmin es hakol, they have to pay everything because they tried to make the person pay 4 or 5 times the amount, so they have to pay 4 or 5 times the amount. And the Gemara says, my lav is it not? Shehi idu al hageneva v'chazru v'hi idu al atvicha, that they testified first about the Geneva, and then they testified about the Tvicha. V'huzmu ala Geneva, then they were falsified about the testimony they gave on the Geneva. V'chazru v'huzmu ala Tvicha, and then they went ahead and they were falsified again, this time falsified on the testimony they gave on the Tvicha, on the slaughtering. And so the Gemara now says, V'isal kadaitach, now if you think like Abaya, that lemafreya hu nifsal, that when it comes to Eid Zomim, the disqualification is retroactive, so when it comes to this case and this situation, Kevon di itzamu luhu ha-Geneva, once you have falsified them on their testimony about the Geneva, and again, the Geneva testimony took place first, so Igloi Milsa Lemafreya, so it turns out retroactively, that at the time they were testifying about the Tvicha, they were actually disqualified witnesses. And so if they were disqualified witnesses, that testimony was nothing. So Amai Mishalman at Tvicha, so if that's the case, why are they paying on the Tvicha? Again, it says, if you falsify them on everything, they have to pay everything, 4 or 5 times the amount. But what should turn out is that they turn out to be disqualified witnesses at the time of the Tvicha, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay for the Tvicha when it turns out they're falsified on that. And the Gemara says, Amri, the sages say, and here what are we talking about? Actually, they were first falsified about the Tvicha, about the slaughtering, and again, that testimony was later, so therefore the Geneva testimony is still intact, and that's why they have to pay everything. But the Gemara still says, Amri, but the sages responded to that sof, but still at the end, Kihadri mitzvah Geneva, when it turns out that they were falsified in the Geneva, Egloi Milsa, so still it's going to come out, that at the time they were testifying on the slaughter, they were in fact disqualified. So so we're still back to the same question: why should they pay for the tvicha for the slaughtering? And the Gemara ultimately answers, v'hilchas of the halach is, and the way to understand it is, shehi'idu bevasachas. They testified about all of it at once. V'huzm when they were falsified, so it's all happening at the same time. So they have to pay everything when they are falsified. And Rashi explains, Hachi Garsin, in the proper text is as follows, V'hilchasa shehi'idu bevasachas v'huzmu. The halacha is that we're talking about a situation where they testified both on the Geneva and the Tvicha at one time, and then they were falsified. V'lo Garsin and v'huzmu bevasachas do not have the text as being that they were falsified at one time. That's not necessary. Dekevan dehi'idu bevasachas, because since the testimony, the first testimony was all at one time, lekalamemer b'shas edus Tvicha p'sulan hava, then you're not going to say that at the time they testified on the slaughter they were disqualified. It all happened at the same time. And even if we say that it's all retroactive and they're disqualified retroactively, it's still not going to be a problem for the tvicha. Because everything happened toch kadei dibur. It all happened within the amount of time you can say Shalom Alecha Revi, and therefore that small amount of time, that's the amount of time you can even change your testimony. It's all like one thing. That we don't care if the falsification itself was all at once or one after the other, that doesn't matter. But Rashi does say that it does have to be sheyazomu al hatvicha tchila. It does have to be that first we falsify the witnesses when it comes to the tvicha, the slaughtering, and then we falsify the witnesses when it comes to the geneva. Even if it was toch kadei dibur, Rashi here seems to be arguing that still it would be a problem if you first falsify them on the geneva, because then already the tvicha would not be a testimony at all. And the Gemara continues, Leima ketanoi, let us say that this is a machlokas tanoim. Hayushnayim mi'idin oso shaganav. If two people testify about a certain person that he stole, v'hein mi'idin oso shatavach, and then they testify that he slaughtered. V'huzmu ala ganeva, and then they are falsified on the stealing in terms of their testimony that he stole. Eidos shabat l'miksasa bat l'kula. We say that if you have a testimony that some of it is nullified, the whole thing is nullified. Huzmu al hatvicha, if they are falsified on the slaughtering, so in that situation, hu mishalem tashlume kefil, so he'll still pay kefil, meaning the ganav still pays kefil because that part of the testimony was not falsified. Ve'ein mishalem tashlume shlosha, but they'll pay the rest. What they tried to add on with the tvicha, they're going to pay the 3 times the amount. Amar Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi says, when is this true? B'shtei edius. It's talking when there are 2 testimonies. The Gemara will discuss exactly what this means. Avol be'edus achas, but if it would be one testimony, edus shebat l'miksasa bat l'kula, then if you have an edus that is partially nullified, then it is totally nullified. And Rashi explains, Hayushnayim mi'idim oso shagana v'hein atzmam mi'idim oso shatavach. If 2 people testify that the person stole, and they themselves also testify that the person slaughtered the animal, and then it turns out they're falsified on the fact, on the testimony that he stole, batal akula, so then the entire edus is nullified. Umeshalmi kefil, and if it's all batal, so they have to pay kefil, because they did try to make him pay kefil, and that was falsified. V'hu pater, and he's entirely pater, because everything they testified to is thrown out. Tekevin de lo ganav lo tavach, because since he didn't steal, he obviously didn't slaughter the stolen animal, meaning to say it wasn't a stolen animal that he slaughtered. Now, even if they are then falsified in the tvicha, p'turin, they are going to be pater. And the note over here in the Mesoras Hashas says Svar Macher and Pater, that he's going to be Pater, meaning on that extra payment. But in any case, the point over here is all that will happen is they will pay kefil because they were falsified in terms of the kefil. Everything else is essentially thrown out. And then it said, who's mu'al atvicha? Then the Brisa said, if they're falsified on the slaughtering, v'lo ala geneva, but they're not falsified when it comes to the geneva, when it comes to the stealing. So then it said, in that case, he's going to pay kefil, and they will pay the tashlumei shlosha, they'll pay 3 times the amount. And then Rabbi Yossi said, Ba'med devar ma'amurim, when is this true? And Rashi understands that to mean, to whom mishalim kefil? When is it true that he pays the kefil? V'lo batal edus geneva b'shtei edyus, and we don't say that the edus on the geneva is nullified. That's true when there are two testimonies. Then we say that he pays kefil, but if it would be edus achas, then we actually would say edus shabat l'miksasa bat l'kula. And the Gemara continues, "Mai b'shtei edyus u'mai be'edus achas." What does Rabbi Yossi mean when he says two testimonies, and what does he mean when he says one testimony? If you're going to say two testimonies means two actual testimonies, meaning b'shtei kitos, that it means to say two different sets of witnesses. And be'edus achas, and what does it mean one testimony? Bekas achas bozer charzet means that there's one set of witnesses, and they testify first about the geneva, and then they testify about the tvicha, about the slaughtering. V'yomer Rabbi Yossi, and then according to that, Rabbi Yossi would be saying be'edus achas, that if it's one set of witnesses, bekas achas bozer charzet, one set of witnesses testifying first about the geneva and then about the tvicha, and then they're falsified about the tvicha, if that's what he means. So it doesn't make sense. Ki misahadi geneva, they testify on the stealing. V'hadar misahadi tvicha, and then they testify on the slaughtering. Ki mitzmi tvicha, so then Rabbi Yossi is saying that when they're falsified on the slaughtering, Eidos shabat l'miksasa bat l'kula, that since it's partially nullified, it's totally nullified of itzimuluhu ageneva, and then they're going to be falsified on the stealing. Meschet, why should you say such a thing? That doesn't make any sense. These are independent edyus. If you falsify the slaughtering, that doesn't mean you have falsified the stealing. Meschet, where should we get such a halacha? So that can't be what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Elalav, rather is it not that Rabbi Yossi means as follows. B'shtei edyus, what does it mean, two testimonies? It means be'edus achas, ke'ein shtei edyus. You have one testimony that's sort of like two testimonies. Umaynin, and what does that mean? Kas achas poseh charzet means if you have one set, one after the other. That's what he means. Ba'med devarim amurim, if it's one set, one after the other, then we say what we said above, that the individual will still pay the kefil. You have falsified their testimony on the tvicha. You have not falsified their testimony on the geneva, and he pays kefil. But if it's one testimony all happening at one time, so then in that situation where it's not bazeh charzeh, there we would say edus shabat l'miksasa bat l'kula. And the Gemara continues, V'savru, and right now we think, to kuli alma, that everybody agrees, toch kedei dibur kedibur dami, that if something is said toch kedei dibur, within those 3 seconds, you have the one testimony and then the other testimony, that's all like one dibur, it's all like one testimony. And so the Gemara explains, my lav is it not, but hakamiflagi, they're arguing about exactly this point. The Rabbanan savri mikanu l'habon, if so the Rabbanan hold that the disqualification of the Edom Zomin is from the point in time that they are falsified, from the point in time that the second set of Edom come in and say, you were with us. And since they're only disqualified from that point in time, not from earlier at the time they gave the testimony, but from the time they're falsified, so on the slaughtering which they were falsified on, that's falsified. But they weren't falsified on the geneva, and therefore that remains intact. That's why the ganev still pays kefil. But Rabbi Yossi holds that the disqualification is retroactive. And since they testified, it was immediate. It was all together that they testified about the geneva and the tvicha. So therefore, when they're falsified on the slaughtering, they become falsified on the geneva as well. Because we say toch kedei dibur, since it was all within the amount of time to say a short amount of words, it's all considered one. And the Gemara responds to this. Amri, they respond, they said, that's not necessarily the machlokas here. It could be that if toch kedei dibur is considered kedibur, the kuli alma lemafrehu nifsal, maybe everybody would agree that the disqualification is retroactive, and you would throw out the whole testimony. But over here, besoch kedei dibur dami kamiflagi, they're actually arguing whether toch kedei dibur is kedibur dami. Maybe that's actually the machlokas over here in this brisa. That's the machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbanan savri, the Rabbanan hold toch kedei dibur, that toch kedei dibur is not considered dibur. And Rashi explains, if it was one testimony at one time, meaning they testified about both the Genev and the Tvicha, it was all the same testimony, it was besoch kedei dibur. If they say it in one shot, they say on Sunday he stole, and then on Monday he slaughtered. They're falsified about what they said had happened on Monday. And even though they were not falsified on what they said about Sunday. But nevertheless, it's clear that when they gave their testimony, they were disqualified. To Savar Rabbi Yossi Lemafreya Hu Nifsal, Rabbi Yossi holds it's retroactive that there's a disqualification. And the entire testimony is considered nullified. It's all considered one testimony. Kedei Dibur, what does it mean? Kedei Dibur L'Kamman Mafarish. The Gemara will explain later on what exactly Toch Kedei Dibur is, how much time that is. And the other opinion holds Mikanul Haba Miyom Shehuzmu. From the day they're falsified, they're disqualified. V'lo Miyom Sheyidu, not from the day that they testify. And Rashi continues, Geneva de lo mitzvah lo itzam, the Geneva which they were not falsified, if you hold Mikanul Haba, so that testimony is not falsified. Even though all the testimony took place at once, but the actual disqualification didn't start from that point in time. It's only Mikanul Haba. If it started retroactively, so then we would have said, even though they weren't falsified on the Sunday testimony, but at the time they testified, they were disqualified. That's what we would have said if it was Lemafreya, but we don't say that. We say Mikanul Haba, and therefore the testimony on the Geneva remains intact. And finally, Rashi notes, Itzmuluhu Nami Geneva, that when the Gemara said that they're falsified also on the Geneva, if you hold Lemafreya, Rashi notes, Hai Itzmu Lav Hazama Dafka L'Shalei Mammon. This word Itzmu doesn't mean they really ate him Zoman to pay money. Rather, Ela Ifsaluluhu Geneva Meshum Psul Edus. It just means they were disqualified as witnesses, and therefore that testimony is thrown out. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis.